The Ryders were a young family, starting fresh. New town, new hopes. They left the city one bright morning, headed for Willow Creek with 2 kids, a van full of belongings, and no reason to look back. But they never arrived. No calls, no sightings, no trace. For 4 years, their disappearance haunted everyone, until a renovation worker cracked the basement floor and unearthed a secret no one was meant to find. The day they left New York, the air was thick with spring warmth, the kind that hinted at freedom. Ethan Ryder glanced at his rearview mirror and smiled softly at the image it captured. His wife Laura checking on their kids in the back seat, Ava humming a silly tune, and little Miles playing with the straps of his backpack. Their van was filled to the brim with boxes, sleeping bags, a few potted plants Laura refused to leave behind, and a carefully folded American flag from Ethan's late father. It was more than a move, it was escape. Ethan had spent the last 3 months finalizing the sale of their old apartment, wrapping up loose ends at his small logistics firm, and securing the paperwork for their new home, a 2-star farmhouse in Willow Creek, a quiet town nestled against the Adirondack foothills. The house had appeared in an off-market listing through a friend of a friend. A rare opportunity, the seller had said. The price was unusually low, the process unusually fast. No realtors, just a cash transfer and a signature witnessed by a notary who barely looked up from her papers. But Ethan hadn't questioned it. In fact, he'd insisted on moving quickly. He wanted out of the city, out of everything it reminded him of. He told Laura it was about peace and nature and raising the kids in a better environment, but deep down he knew it was also about burying what had happened a year ago. A failed investment, a fallout with his former business partner, and a letter that arrived one night without a return address. "You stole. You will pay," he never told Laura. He shredded it and moved on. Or at least tried to. They had kept things vague with friends and neighbors. "We're heading upstate," Laura would say with a smile. "Fresh air, country life." Only her younger sister, Melanie, knew the exact location. Laura had texted it to her on the morning they left, adding a heart emoji. Melanie had replied, "Sounds dreamy. Send pics." That would be the last time she'd hear from her. The trip was supposed to take 4.5 hours, maybe 5 with a stop for snacks. They left mid-morning, just after 9 a.m. Traffic was light. Kept the music low, letting the sound of tires on pavement lull them into a strange serenity. Somewhere along Route 87, they stopped for gas and sandwiches. The clerk remembered them. "Seemed happy," she would later tell police. "The little girl asked for gum. I gave her a free piece." After the last gas station, the road thinned. Civilization began to disappear behind stretches of woods and unpaved turns. Ethan took a final right onto Millstone Road, a narrow path that cut between tree-lined hills. The house was just ahead, past a collapsed fence and a rusted mailbox that still read, "Climb." Ethan had texted Melanie at that moment, "We're here, looks quiet, a little weird, but fine." That text was time-stamped at 2:12 p.m. They were never heard from again. That evening, Melanie tried calling, straight to voicemail. No response to her follow-up message, "How's the place? Need help unpacking?" At first she assumed they were busy, but as night fell, worry crept in. By morning, it turned into panic. The police weren't concerned at first. "Maybe they're just off the grid," the officer had said. "No service in those parts." But Melanie knew her sister. Laura always checked in. Always. 2 days later, a report was filed. A missing family. No signs of an accident on the roads, no pings from their phones, no credit card activity. The farmhouse sat untouched, locked, still with the for sale sign barely hanging onto one hinge. When authorities arrived, they found the house empty, just as the seller had described. Old wallpaper peeling, furniture gone, and a thick layer of dust on every surface. Not a single footprint, not a sign of a move-in. The Ryder family had vanished somewhere between asphalt and gravel, city and forest, the past and a promise. Neighbors didn't have much to say. "Never saw anyone move in," one said. "Heard the house got sold, but no one ever came," another muttered. "That place gives me the creeps. Been empty since Klein left." Harold Klein. The name on the mailbox, the man who sold the house to Ethan. No one in town knew where he had gone, only that he left fast and quiet about a month before the sale. His last mail collected, a light on in the attic left burning for weeks before someone cut the power. He had left no forwarding address. In the weeks that followed, search teams combed the forest. Drones flew overhead. Bloodhounds sniffed tire tracks that faded into mud. Nothing. No van, no trailer, no Ava, no Miles. It was as if the forest swallowed them whole. But someone had seen them. One man, a retired postmaster living 3 miles east, told investigators he remembered seeing a dark green van towing a small trailer heading west that afternoon. Looked like it was riding low, he said. Heavy with boxes, maybe. But his timeline was off, and he wasn't sure if it was that day or the one before. Investigators pulled camera footage from nearby towns. At one point, the van appeared briefly crossing a small bridge. Then, nothing. Not at the turnoff, not near Willow Creek, like it had vanished into the tree. And so theories began to emerge. They got lost, ran off, were targeted. Some said Ethan had debts. Others whispered about land disputes. A few believed the family never intended to arrive. But no evidence supported any of it. Melanie kept calling the phones every week for a year, straight to voicemail. Sometimes she would leave messages just to talk, as if they were listening, until March 3rd kept coming to call, as if they were listening, at a startled call that miled away back into the web. But the silence only grew heavier. By the 2nd anniversary of their disappearance, their case had joined the growing list of unresolved missing persons in the state's cold case unit. The farmhouse was eventually boarded up. Grass grew through the porch steps. The mailbox rusted clean off. And Ethan's text remained the only clue. "We're here, looks quiet, a little weird, but fine." The investigation deepened quickly as the first days passed and no trace of the Ryder family surfaced. What troubled the authorities most was the lack of any digital footprint. Typically in such cases, traffic cameras would provide at least a few clues: license plates, directional patterns, timestamps to reconstruct movements, but in this case surveillance footage yielded an unsettling gap. The family's green Honda Odyssey, last seen on footage crossing a steel-arched bridge at approximately 1:46 p.m., completely vanished shortly after that point. Investigators were able to determine that the next stretch of the road led into a dense, unmonitored forest corridor, a 10-mile path known locally as Gray Hollow Drive. There were no cameras beyond that bridge. The next camera was installed at a gas station 12 miles later, but the Ryder van never appeared there. It was as though it had driven into the woods and dissolved into thin air. This blackout zone on Gray Hollow Drive was notorious among locals, not for anything criminal, but for its sheer remoteness. The road was rarely used except by logging trucks and locals with cabins tucked miles off the beaten path. There were rumors, of course. People said the GPS often lost signal there, and radio static would spike of a landslide back in the 80s that had temporarily buried a section of the road. None of it amounted to more than coincidence, but for the detectives working the Ryder case, the road's dark reputation began to feel less like folklore and more like an invisible wall between two realities, before and after. Melanie Hargrove, Laura's younger sister, became the unofficial archivist of the case. She preserved every message, every call log, every note she'd written since that day. But the most chilling artifact in her possession was the final message Laura had sent. "We made it, but something feels off here." It came in at 2:12 p.m., just minutes after the van had last been spotted crossing the bridge. That message never reached Ethan's friends, nor did it sync to any cloud backup. Melanie received it while on her lunch break and thought little of it at first. She had assumed Laura was just reacting to an old house in need of repairs, maybe some odd smell or a power outage. It was only later that the choice of words, "something feels off," would keep her awake at night. Despite repeated efforts, investigators were unable to retrieve the metadata from the message. It had arrived like a ghost, pinged from a location that no longer registered, from a phone that had since gone dark. Technicians from the service provider explained that the tower logs were incomplete in that region, possibly due to terrain interference or outdated equipment. Whatever the cause, the technical void reinforced the emotional one. Melanie's repeated texts, "What's off?" "You okay?" "Call me," all went unanswered. She forwarded the message to detectives, hoping it would spur something. It did, but not what she had hoped for. With no other leads, the state police dispatched a forensic unit into the woods flanking Gray Hollow Drive. They worked in pairs, combing each side of the road, peering down embankments and through thickets for signs of tire tracks, disturbed soil, any trace of a van hauling a trade. Nothing turned up. Helicopters swept the area, dogs were brought in, but the Ryder family might as well have driven into another dimension. There was no broken glass, no skid marks, no personal belongings scattered on the roadside. Only trees and silence. Adding to the mystery, the trailer attached to the van, loaded with everything from kids' bicycles to a collapsible dining set, should have made their vehicle unusually large and heavy. Yet it left no noticeable impression on any terrain. Rangers brought in to assess whether a cliff or sinkhole could have swallowed the vehicle ruled it out. No fresh craters, no soil collapse, not even a loose patch of gravel out of place. A week after the disappearance, the incident was officially escalated from a missing persons report to a suspicious disappearances. Melanie's role evolved from sister to surrogate investigator. She compiled maps, printed out satellite images, and traced possible logging paths off Gray Hollow. But she always came back to that message, its timing, its ambiguity. She had read it hundreds of times, interpreting its tone differently each time. Was Laura scared? Was she just unsettled by a creaky floorboard or a strange neighbor? Or had she seen something or someone that didn't belong? Detectives asked Melanie repeatedly if she had any reason to believe Laura or Ethan were involved in anything dangerous. Any debts, threats, secrets? She said no every time, but the truth was, even Melanie had begun to wonder. Ethan had always been private, a little too private. He worked long hours and rarely spoke about his job beyond the generic term logistics. Once, Laura had mentioned that he lost money in a bad investment, but had taken care of it. Melanie hadn't pushed for details then. Now she regretted that. One of the more promising leads came from a lumberjack named Doug Halpern, who claimed he saw a green van on a dirt road near mile marker 31 off Gray Hollow. The report was taken seriously and a team was sent to investigate. But what they found was a hunter's blind and several beer cans. No tire tracks, no van. Doug was ruled unreliable, part-time drunk, full-time exaggerator. Still, his story planted seeds. Was there a second road, a private entrance to the property that the family had unknowingly taken? Could someone have redirected them? As the days turned to weeks, the lack of evidence became its own statement. Families don't just disappear in America. There are always traces, witnesses, paper trails, digital echoes. But in the case of the Ryders, there was nothing after 2:12 p.m. No bank activity, no mobile signal, no social media. Their belongings remained in limbo. The apartment in New York still half-packed, their storage unit unpaid. Laura's book club still receiving auto-reminders. The farmhouse, meanwhile, sat quietly at the edge of Willow Creek. No one came to claim it. The lawn grew high. A light bulb above the porch flickered from time to time, the product of a timer set long ago. Deputies checked the house multiple times and found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, no fingerprints on the doorknob besides those of the previous owner, and yet, according to Ethan's message, they had arrived. And so the question began to haunt everyone involved in the case, not just where did they go, but when. Was their last message truly from the front steps of the farmhouse, or from somewhere nearby? Could it have been staged? Could someone else have sent it, using Laura's phone to plant a false lead? And if so, why did no one see them arrive, hear them unload, or witness them leaving? The silence thickened around Gray Hollow, turning curiosity into dread. Locals started avoiding the road entirely. Rumors reawakened. Some said the house was cursed, others blamed old debts or retribution. A few whispered about a family who once lived there and never truly left. Melanie, however, didn't believe in curses. She believed that someone somewhere knew exactly what had happened at 2:12 p.m. that April afternoon. The morning air was heavy with silence when the investigative team returned to the farmhouse. It had been 3 days since the Ryders were reported missing, and the growing pressure from local news stations had prompted the state police to conduct a full search of the property. Detective Avery Hunt led the unit, a seasoned officer with little patience for speculation. She had seen too many missing persons cases spiral into myth. As she stepped through the front gate of the Willow Creek farmhouse, she expected to find a mess, evidence of a hasty arrival, signs of a break-in, something. But the house stood undisturbed, as if no one had crossed its threshold in years. The porch groaned softly under their boots, and when they reached the front door, they found it locked. No scuffs on the frame, no broken glass, no scratch marks on the latch. Using the backup key left by the seller's attorney, they entered cautiously. Inside, the house was dim, the air stale. A layer of dust coated the wooden floor, undisturbed even by footprints. There were no signs of unpacking, no boxes, no children's toys, no indication that the Ryder family had ever stepped inside. The kitchen counters were bare except for a stack of unopened utility bills, all addressed to the previous owner, Harold Klein. In the living room, cobwebs laced the corners of the ceiling, and an old wall clock had stopped at 4:18, the battery long dead. The officers swept through each room methodically. Upstairs, the bedrooms remained empty, with no mattresses, no linens, not even a forgotten hanger. Downstairs in the basement, a thin film of mold clung to the concrete walls. It was cold still and entirely devoid of human presence. Avery's frustration simmered. If they made it here, she muttered to her partner, Officer Reed, they sure didn't stay long. Reed nodded, flipping open his notepad. We're either looking at a mistake in the timeline or something happened before they could move in. Back in the kitchen, as one officer opened drawers looking for any paperwork left behind, something clattered against the back of a cabinet. Tucked behind a loose panel in the lowest drawer was a folded piece of thick parchment. Curious, Reed pulled it out and unfurled it on the dusty kitchen table. It was a hand-drawn map, sepia-toned with faded ink lines, clearly old but surprisingly detailed. The map bore the title Willow Creek Territory, 1947, and showed the surrounding areas in a layout that didn't match current satellite imagery. Dirt roads, creeks, and structures were marked with precision, but what caught Avery's attention were the red X's scattered across the wooded sections north and west of the house. Each X was labeled with cryptic initials, GR, ELN, and a year next to it, none later than 1953. Some marks were scratched out. In the lower margin, written in a looping, spidery script, was the phrase, "Closed paths never forget." Avery frowned, pulling out her phone to compare the map with the current one. Most of the marked roads no longer existed. Several of the structures labeled as cabins or mills were completely absent from modern maps. The area labeled Foxtine Hollow, heavily marked on the old map, didn't appear anywhere in recent records. Could be logging sites, Reed offered, or maybe old bootlegging routes, but something about the deliberate markings felt purposeful, even ominous. As they continued their sweep, the rest of the team confirmed the house was clear. No blood, no signs of violence. Forensics turned up no prints belonging to the Ryders, not even on the front door. It was as if they had never arrived, despite the text message, despite Ethan's van being reportedly seen nearby. Could they have gone to the wrong house? One officer asked. But the GPS logs from Laura's phone, while incomplete, confirmed their coordinates had reached this exact property line. That, and the tone of Laura's last message, made it unlikely they had simply driven away. The weather shifted. Clouds gathered low over the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Avery stood at the back of the property, staring into the woods beyond the fence. The map in her hand showed a trail leading directly from the edge of the yard into the forest. It was labeled Crow's Path existed on Google Earth. When she walked to the fence line, however, she spotted a faint depression in the earth, a line of trampled grass leading into the thicket. She marked it with orange tape. Back inside, Reed studied the utility bills again. Something didn't add up. The electric company had stopped billing 2 months before the sale, yet the seller claimed to have vacated only 4 weeks ago. Curious, Reed phoned the company, asking for a service history. The rep confirmed that while the account was closed, power had continued flowing to the home until a technician physically shut it off 10 days ago. That meant someone had been in the house post-sale, possibly living off-grid or using it as a waypoint. Reed brought the theory to Avery. If someone was here after the power was cut, but before we arrived, he trailed off. Avery nodded. Then maybe the Ryders weren't the only ones planning to use this house. She thought of the old map, the red X's, and the trail behind the fence. There was a story buried in these woods. She could feel it. Later that afternoon, the forensics team discovered something strange under the floorboards of the hallway closet. One of the floor panels was newer than the rest, less worn, nailed differently. When they pried it open, they found an empty cavity just large enough to fit a person lying flat. It was cleaned, lined with foam insulation. At first they suspected it had been used for smuggling or hiding, but a tiny inscription on the wood's underside caught Avery's attention. HM October 21st, 62. Initials again, a date, possibly a signature, a message she didn't know. That evening, Melanie was brought back to the house. She stood in the kitchen as Avery showed her the map. Melanie recognized none of the markings, but when she looked closer, her face went pale. She pointed to one of the red X's in the upper corner of the map. "That's our family's old cabin," she said. "That's where Laura and I used to go as kids. We called it Fern Rock." Avery circled the X. That cabin hadn't existed on any maps in decades. If someone else had known about it, if it had been used or watched, they had to go there. But daylight was fading fast. Avery ordered the search to begin at dawn. The map would be scanned, analyzed, compared with state records. Something inside her told her that this wasn't just about a missing family anymore. It was about what had been forgotten, intentionally erased from Willow Creek's past, the kind of forgetting that required silence. And now, maybe, the Ryders had stumbled into something that had never wanted to be remembered. Detective Avery Hunt's next move was methodical. The appearance of that aged map raised too many questions, and she knew it wasn't a coincidence that the house it had been found in had a history as opaque as the surrounding forest. She turned her attention to the seller, Harold Klein. Public records showed he had purchased the farmhouse in 1993 and held it for nearly 30 years, never listing it publicly until the farmhouse already disappeared, never listing it publicly until the farmhouse already farm-it deal with Ethan Wright. The house had remained unoccupied for most of that time, despite Klein's records listing him as residing there until just 4 weeks prior to the sale. That timeline didn't sit well with Avery. Property tax documents confirmed he hadn't claimed the property as his primary residence, yet utility records revealed periodic power usage spikes and odd water consumption patterns. It wasn't the behavior of a family or long-term tenant, but rather someone using the house intermittently, quietly, discreetly. Dusty digging deeper into Harold Klein's background, Avery discovered that he had once operated a small construction firm, Klein Foundations and Masonry, which had shut down in 2011. According to state licensing boards, the closure was due to an administrative lapse, but an anonymous tip from a former subcontractor revealed more. Klein had reportedly taken on work for private clients involving special builds, projects requiring rapid, low-visibility execution. When Avery contacted Klein's last known associate, she learned that Klein had abruptly liquidated his company assets and relocated to Vancouver, Canada, just 1 month before selling the farmhouse. He'd left no forwarding address, no phone number, just a notarized POA filed with a real estate attorney who processed the house's transfer. That attorney, pressed by investigators, admitted that Klein had requested an unusually fast close. The house was listed at $110,000, 0 cents, nearly 40% below the market value for the area, with no inspections required. Ethan had paid in full via a cashier's check. To Avery, this wasn't just a motivated seller, it was someone washing their hands of a place that carried more weight than walls and flooring. She pushed to get a federal inquiry launched into Klein's travel records, and as expected, he had taken a one-way flight to Vancouver through a small regional airport under his legal name, but used a second GLAG ID number for the booking. That raised a flag. When authorities cross-referenced that number, it matched an inactive contractor's license in Pennsylvania that had been linked to a different alias years prior, one connected to a fraud case that was ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence. Avery now saw a man who knew how to hide his tracks and sell off liability without raising alarm. But if he had something to do with the Ryders' disappearance, why sell to them? Why not let the house rot quietly, unsold and forgotten? Back in New York, a parallel thread emerged. Melanie, still holding tight to her sister's memory, requested access to Ethan's financial records. While Laura had been in charge of the day-to-day budgeting, Ethan had managed their long-term investments. Melanie, working with a family attorney, obtained a court order to release the documents. What they revealed painted a different version of Ethan than even his wife had likely known. In late 2020, he had invested over $100,000, 0 cents, into a startup called Solera Apex Logistics, a tech-forward shipping firm promising drone-facilitated deliveries. The company had made headlines briefly before collapsing in early 2021 under allegations of embezzlement. The lawsuits followed. The founders vanished. Ethan had been listed as a Tier B investor, which meant he had no recourse or legal protection under the fund structure. His entire contribution had been wiped out. What stunned Avery was that this financial hit never made it into the family's visible history. No debt collections, no flagged accounts. Ethan had covered the loss quietly, transferring assets from a joint savings account into a private account under his name and slowly siphoning the funds toward the investment over 8 months. Even more troubling, emails between Ethan and a legal consultant showed his intention to sue the startup founders individually, but later backed out due to credible threats. That phrase caught Avery's eye. Who had threatened him, and why hadn't he told Laura? If someone had made threats over money, had those threats escalated? Was it possible Ethan's past financial entanglements had followed him into Willow Creek? Avery began constructing a timeline. Ethan had liquidated a portion of their retirement in early January 2022. The house purchase was finalized in mid-February. The family went missing in April. That gave a 2-month gap, 2 months in which something could have happened that forced them to move quickly, quietly, and off-grid. That might explain why they told no one where they were going, why they didn't even post about the move on social media. Ethan's behavior no longer seemed like cautious optimism. It seemed like a calculated retreat. Looking closer at Solera Apex Logistics, Avery found that several other mid-level investors had faced harassment following the company's collapse. One woman in Boston reported someone breaking into her apartment but stealing nothing. Another man in Portland received a dead bird in the mail. None of the incidents were linked officially, but whispers floated around online forums where investors compared notes. "They want us to forget," one post read. "They'll erase you if you don't shut up." Avery compiled all this into a report and handed it to the FBI field office. The agent in charge promised to dig into Solera Apex further, but she could tell they considered it tenuous. Without hard evidence of a link between the startup and the disappearances, it was circumstantial. But to Avery, the picture was forming. A disgraced startup, a man with secrets, a house with its own history, and a seller eager to disappear. Then there was the map. What if Harold Klein had used the house for something? What if those X's marked more than just old cabins? What if Ethan's past, his debt, his desperation, intersected with a place that wasn't just dangerous because of what lay in the woods, but because of what had once happened there? She returned to the farmhouse the next morning, the map rolled tightly in her hand. Standing in the kitchen where it had been found, she looked around again, this time not for blood or signs of struggle, but for logic. Any clue as to why Ethan would bring his family to a place like this? Her eyes landed on the breaker box near the back door. It was scratched, paint chipped, but something about the lock struck her. It wasn't the standard home variety, it was industrial, the kind used on warehouses. She opened it. Inside, a circuit was labeled Bunker Panel Extra. That wasn't in the original blueprints. 4 years passed in uneasy silence. The disappearance of the Ryder family faded from front-page headlines into cold case files, living on only in sporadic online forums and late-night theories shared by true crime enthusiasts. Willow Creek had moved on, or at least pretended to. The farmhouse remained untouched during that time, locked in probate until the state released it back into the market due to tax delinquency and the lack of any legal claims. In 2026, it caught the attention of a property investor named Derek Wells. Derek was in his mid-40s, ambitious and pragmatic, known in real estate circles for flipping distressed properties in remote areas and turning solid profits. He wasn't sentimental. When he saw the farmhouse listed at a government auction for a mere $38,000, 0 cents, he jumped at the opportunity. To him, it was just another investment. Within a week, Derek had contractors on site. His plan was simple: restore the structure with modern fixtures while maintaining its rustic charm. The initial assessments noted dry rot, some roof damage, and outdated electrical systems, but nothing he hadn't handled before. What no one expected was what the demolition team discovered in the living room. While tearing up the old floor to install undersquat heating pipes, one of the workers, Luis Montenegro, a subcontractor, paused as his jackhammer met unexpected resistance. The concrete beneath the floorboards was different. Most of the slab was uniform gray, aged and cracking from decades of use. But one section near the back corner was smoother, paler, and clearly newer. Luis tapped it with a steel rod. It sounded hollow. He called his supervisor. Derek arrived 20 minutes later, coffee in hand, curious more than concerned. When they drilled through the odd section, the drill bit broke through sooner than expected. Dust clouded the air as they pulled up a chunk of the slab, revealing a square cavity no more than 4 feet deep. Inside they found a rusted metal trunk sealed with leather straps and a padlock, though the lock had already been cracked. Luis hesitated before opening it. When he did, the contents made him stagger back. Inside were neatly folded clothes, children's shirts, a small pink raincoat, socks no larger than the palm of a hand. There was a plush rabbit, missing an ear, its fur discolored by time, and lying across the pile of fabric was a man's wristwatch, face cracked diagonally, the hands frozen at 2:17. The brand was Fossil, the initials faintly engraved on the inside clasp. Derek turned pale. He knew exactly what name those initials matched. Within hours, the property was taped off. Derek contacted local authorities, referencing the case he had read about years ago, the Ryder family, the vanished children, the eerie text message. Detectives arrived with evidence techs and forensics. The cavity was carefully excavated, and though it revealed no bodies, the presence of personal belongings made one thing clear. Someone had placed those items there deliberately, and recently enough that the concrete hadn't yet weathered there. Further inspection of the surrounding foundation showed that the concrete patch had been poured post-2019, well after the official disappearance watch was run through database records and confirmed by Melanie Hargrove, still listed as next of kin, to have belonged to Ethan. She recognized it immediately, describing a chipped mark on the band that matched the one in photos. Melanie's voice trembled as she pointed to the raincoat. "That's Ava's," she whispered. She hated umbrellas. The presence of these items in such a carefully concealed location reactivated the investigation. But it also raised horrifying questions. Why hide clothes but no bodies? Why cement them into the house years after the family vanished? Who had access to the property during that window? Detective Avery Hunt, now promoted and transferred to a special cold cases unit, returned to Willow Creek personally. She stood over the open cavity, hands gloved, eyes scanning every corner. "Someone came back," she said quietly. "Someone had something to hide, or a message to leave." Forensics examined the concrete and determined it had been mixed, using a commercial blend not sold at general hardware stores, that suggested professional access, possibly through a supplier or construction firm. Avery immediately thought of Harold Klein and his background in masonry. But records showed Klein had died of a stroke in Canada in 2024, his identity confirmed through consular reports. That trail was closed. Focus turned to other persons of interest. Ethan's financial history resurfaced, especially the Solarara Apex case. The man who had originally recruited him into the investment circle, a corporate liaison named Simon Rokes, had quietly dissolved his own LLC 2 months before the Ryders disappeared. He had since relocated to a rural area in Arizona, living under a new alias. Avery requested federal assistance in pulling his financials. They discovered that in late 2025, Rokes had transferred $3,500.00 to a subcontractor account in upstate New York, a name that matched a drywall and foundation firm located 30 minutes from Willow Creek. The lead grew hotter. The owner of the subcontractor firm, upon questioning, admitted to pouring a small patch job at the farmhouse in early 2025. He claimed he was contracted anonymously through an encrypted payment app, instructed only to pour over a prepared box that the client would leave exposed. He was told not to ask questions. The man, clearly shaken by the visit from detectives, confessed that something about the job felt wrong. No name, no return number, only a digitally signed work order from someone calling themselves Mitt. Back at the precinct, Avery pulled up Ethan's email history, what fragments they had recovered from archived servers. One message stood out. It had come from an anonymous account 6 days before the move. "Don't forget what you owe. Finish what you started, or they'll finish it for you." It wasn't clear whether Ethan had replied, but the message now took on a darker meaning. Did Ethan know he was being followed? Had he planned to confront someone? Or worse, had he tried to make a deal? The location of the hidden trunk also raised another theory. It was placed near the base of a fireplace, a spot structurally integral to the house. Whoever hid it knew the layout. This wasn't random. It was a message to someone who would return, someone who would eventually find it. But who? Melanie was brought back again. This time she noticed something the officers hadn't. Tacked inside the trunk's lid was a plastic sandwich bag, taped to the underside. It held a single Polaroid photo, heavily faded. In it, a man stood next to a forest trail marker labeled Ridge Path 7. The man's face was unclear, but the jacket he wore had a patch, one Melanie recognized immediately. It belonged to Ethan. She had seen that same windbreaker dozens of times. "That's him," she said, "but I've never seen this photo before." And that's when Louise, the contractor, spoke up again. He remembered something strange from the day they arrived, before the demo began. "The basement light," he said. "It was on when we first walked in. I thought someone left it by accident, but now—" "I'm not so sure." Detective Avery Hunt stood at the edge of the newly exposed cavity, the scent of damp earth and something far more metallic clinging to the air as forensic techs moved carefully beneath the remaining concrete slab. What began as the uncovering of a sealed trunk had now become a full-scale excavation. Thermal imaging had revealed irregularities in the subfloor's structure that went deeper than the initial discovery suggested. Within hours, jackhammers broke through another layer, this time revealing a secondary chamber, a reinforced crawl space about 5 feet high, barely accessible. As one of the forensic team members crouched down and shone a flashlight into the crevice, the silence in the room thickened. "Bones," he said flatly, voice muffled by his respirator. Avery's stomach twisted. The Ryder family was no longer just missing. They were here, and they had been all along. Forensics halted work and requested additional support. The chamber was photographed in meticulous detail, each layer of soil gently removed, each fragment of evidence logged with clinical precision. When the bones were finally extracted and transported to the county lab, preliminary analysis confirmed what everyone feared. 4 distinct sets of remains were identified. 2 adults, 1 male and 1 female, and 2 children under the age of 10. Dental records and DNA swabs, cross-referenced with Melanie Hargrove's samples, left no doubt. Ethan, Laura, Ava, and Miles Ryder had been entombed beneath the house, where they had hoped to begin anew. But the horror didn't end with identification. The medical examiner's report arrived within 48 hours, and its findings were sobering. There were no signs of blunt force trauma on any of the remains, no fractures, no gunshot wounds, nothing to suggest a violent attack, at least not in the conventional sense. However, the children's remains presented chilling evidence, and particulate residue in the sinus cavities indicated as asphyxiation. Ava and Miles had died from a lack of oxygen, likely in an enclosed, poorly ventilated space. There were no broken bones, no defensive wounds, just stillness, like they had been sealed away and left to suffocate. Even worse, the adult remains showed ligature marks around the wrists and ankles. Rope fibers had embedded into the bone in narrow ridges. Ethan ulna exhibited microfractures consistent with struggling while bound. Laura's tibia had a similar pattern. Both parents had been restrained. They had not gone down easily. The position of their skeletons suggested they had been placed side by side, intentionally, perhaps even lovingly. It was Laura's skeletal hand, still curved inward, that haunted the forensics lead the most. It seemed to be reaching, as if she had died trying to grasp her daughter's shoulder one last time. Avery stared at the autopsy summaries in silence, her throat dry, her eyes tracing every phrase: ligature indentation, no antemortem, blunt trauma, oxygen deprivation consistent with low intervening. These weren't accidental deaths. This was planned. Someone had bound Ethan and Laura, sealed the children with them, and encased them alive in concrete. Whether they died within hours or days was unclear, but there was no indication that anyone fought back once inside the chamber. Either they were sedated, or they knew resistance was futile. Back at the farmhouse, the crime scene team discovered additional evidence in the subfloor insulation. Small shards of plastic embedded in the wood, later identified as fragments of a children's walkie-talkie. One was still intact enough to be recognized by its brand. When the forensics team examined its casing, they found scratch marks etched along the side, seemingly made with a fingernail. Under magnification, the markings revealed 3 letters: Help K. No more, no sender, just those letters and the haunting silence of 4 years buried in darkness. Avery returned to the site the following morning, unable to sleep. She stood inside the now cleared foundation, rain tapping lightly on the exposed boards. The storm had arrived overnight, and mist clung to the low grass outside like a breath that wouldn't lift. She watched as the body bags were loaded into the coroner's van, 4 in total, lined up in an order that felt too metrical to be accidental. This wasn't rage, she said quietly to Reed, who had joined her on site. This was ritual. Someone planned this, someone watched them come, and someone made sure they'd never leave. Reed nodded, but his face was ashen. Why bring the bodies back? If they were killed somewhere else, why go to the trouble of encasing them under the house? Avery considered that. Because the house meant something, she said. Or maybe it didn't end here. Maybe this is where it began. She returned to her files, re-examining the timeline. Ethan had received the threatening email less than a week before the move. Harold Klein had left the country a month earlier, and now they had confirmed the concrete patch had been poured sometime before day of the 2025, years after the original disappearance. That meant someone had kept the bodies hidden somewhere else for at least 3 years before deciding to return them to the house. The only question was why? Why wait? Why move them? Why now? As Avery pondered, a lab tech entered with a sealed evidence bag. "You'll want to see this," he said. Inside the bag was a Ziploc pouch recovered from beneath Ethan's ribcage, wedged deep between vertebrae. Inside the pouch, a note written on old ledger paper, folded 4 times. The ink was smudged, but legible. It read, "They told me we'd be safe. I believed them. I was wrong. If you find this, don't stop. There's more." Ethan had left a message, a final plea, a warning, a clue. The forensic team hadn't expected to find another note. As the last layer of soil was sifted beneath where Ethan's remains had been, an evidence technician uncovered a tightly folded piece of lined paper, brittle with age and flecked with metal. Unlike Ethan's message, this one bore no signs of panic or last-minute scribbling. The handwriting was harsh, deliberate, carved into the paper with a black ballpoint pen in deep, aggressive stroke. It read, "What you took, you must return." The tone was cold, not a plea, but a demand. And most importantly, it was not in Ethan's handwriting, nor Laura's. Avery had the note authenticated, ink composition, pressure analysis, paper texture. It was written by someone else, someone who wanted this message preserved, hidden within the very tomb they had sealed. The presence of the second note shifted the narrative. The first, Ethan's final confession, suggested a man trapped, betrayed. The second, it was a threat, maybe even a signature. Avery felt it immediately. This wasn't random. This was personal. Whoever orchestrated the Ryders' deaths had done it not just to silence them, but to make a point. The note implied that Ethan had taken something important enough to warrant execution, not just of him, but of his entire family. Reopening the financial trail, Avery revisited the Solara Apex debacle. She dug into the original investor list, tracing shell corporations and funding conduits. A pattern began to emerge. Beneath the legitimate-looking boardrooms and smiling founders was a dark network of silent partners, men who moved money through layered LLCs and offshore accounts. And among them, a familiar name surfaced in an unrelated court deposition from 2017, listed as a contractor on retainer for a private dispute resolution group called Marrow and Gate Holdings. The name had never been linked to criminal activity officially, but in underworld chatter it was rumored to be a front, an organization that specialized in high-value asset retrieval and cleaner operations when legal resolution failed. Avery's pulse quickened as she read further. Marrow and Gate was registered under a trust in Delaware, but multiple addresses used in subcontractor filings led back to abandoned warehouses in Illinois, Arizona, and upstate New York. Harold Klein's construction company, though legally dissolved, had made payments to two of these addresses just months before his sudden exit. To cross-referencing with building permits showed that Klein had taken on short-term jobs at sites that were later linked to accidental fires, renovations, and illegal dumping. One such site had been implicated in a civil trial involving a financial advisor who vanished mid-trigger. Avery now saw Harold Klein in a new light, not just as a shady contractor, but as someone deeply embedded in a violent web of debt collection, asset laundering, and enforced silence. If he had sold the farmhouse to Ethan at a price far below market, it likely wasn't kindness. It was bait. Or a payoff, or worse, an arrangement that Ethan was forced to accept as part of a deal gone wrong. The house, with its hidden chamber and strategic location, had probably been used before, maybe not for murder, but certainly as leverage. She ordered a complete dig through county archives, searching for any mentions of Merrow and Gate, Harold Klein, or Klein Foundations and Masonry in connection with missing persons, or disputed property claims. Within days, a match turned up. In 2009, a family from Albany had filed a complaint after a relative disappeared shortly after buying a remote fixer-upper in a wooded area near Ticonderoga. The seller? Harold Klein. The sale? All cash. The police report? Inconclusive. The house was eventually torn down after a fire, officially ruled an accident. Avery tracked down the former lead investigator on that case. Retired now, he recalled the details all too clearly. The place felt wrong, he said. We found strange markings in the basement, like something had been scrubbed clean, but there wasn't enough evidence to push charges. When Avery mentioned the name Merrow and Gate, the old detective's face hardened. Yeah, he said. Name came up once. A man left a voicemail claiming to have information. Before we could call him back, the number was disconnected. And then we never heard from him again. Armed with this new context, Avery returned to the Ryder file. Ethan's email exchange with the now vanished consultant, the threats, the silence, it all fit. He had stumbled into something more dangerous than a failed startup. The money he'd lost wasn't just evaporated in bad stocks. It had passed through hands designed to disappear, and someone, somewhere, believed Ethan had taken more than his fair share or broken a rule. But what? What did he know? What had he kept? The second note's wording haunted her. What you took, you must return. If it wasn't money, was it information, documents, leverage? Something Ethan planned to use to protect his family, and if so, had his death been a message to others inside that network? Meanwhile, tech analysts uncovered something unusual from the recovered photo Melanie had identified. The Polaroid, Ethan at the Ridge Path signpost, had a number sequence barely visible in the corner, digitally imprinted beneath the developer ink. It matched a timestamp format used in a surveillance program linked to a private intelligence contractor. Translation? The photo wasn't taken with a commercial camera. It had been printed from an internal surveillance system, which meant someone had followed Ethan, tracked him, and taken that photo to prove they knew where he'd been. This wasn't paranoia anymore, it was structure. The timing of Klein's departure, the resurfacing of the Ryders' remains, the photo, the messages, it was all orchestrated. Someone had waited until the heat died down, until the house passed into the hands of an uninvolved party before planting the evidence back beneath its floorboards. As a warning, or as closure for an internal score points. If Merrow and Gate still operated, even in shadow, someone out there knew how this had been carried out, and more importantly, someone knew who had ordered it. She needed names, contractors, paper trails. She needed to find out who made that second note and why they had buried it with the Ryders. Like a receipt, like a signature burned into concrete. The discovery of the second note had left Avery with more questions than answers. The message, "What you took, you must return," suggested a vendetta, a transaction gone awry. But what if the Ryders weren't the intended targets? What if they were collateral damage in a larger, more sinister game? Meanwhile, Derek Wells, the property investor who had unwittingly uncovered the horror beneath the farmhouse, found himself unable to shake the feeling that the house still held secrets. One afternoon, as he surveyed the overgrown fields behind the property, he noticed the dilapidated barn that had long been forgotten. Its weathered wood and sagging roof hinted at decades of neglect. Curiosity piqued. Derek ventured inside. The barn was a relic of the past, filled with rusted tools, decaying hay bales, and the pungent scent of mold. Looking down, he saw an old, dust-covered security camera, its lens cracked but still intact. Intrigued, he picked it up and noticed a small, blinking light on the side. Remarkably, the device still had power. Back at his office, Derek connected the camera to his computer, hoping to retrieve any stored footage. To his surprise, the device contained several hours of video dated 2 days before the Ryders were scheduled to move in. The footage was grainy and black and white, but it clearly showed a group of individuals wearing masks and dark clothing approaching the farmhouse under the cover of night. They carried large duffel bags and moved with practiced precision. The intruders entered the house, and for the next hour the camera captured their movements as they scoured each room. They appeared to be searching for something specific, opening drawers, lifting floorboards, and even tapping on walls. Suddenly, one of them froze, as if alerted by an unseen signal. The group quickly gathered their bags and exited the house, disappearing into the house. Avery reviewed the footage multiple times, noting the efficiency and coordination of the intruders. This wasn't a random burglary, it was a calculated operation. The timing was also critical, 2 days before the Ryders' arrival. It raised the possibility that the house had been a target for reasons unrelated to its new occupants. Delving deeper into the house's history, Avery discovered that the previous owner, Harold Klein, had ties to a clandestine organization known for handling dispute resolutions outside the bounds of legality. Klein's sudden departure to Canada and his involvement with Merrow and Gate Holdings, a company with a reputation for cleaning up financial messes, added layers to the mystery. Avery theorized that the intruders were searching for something left behind by Klein or his associates, perhaps evidence of illicit activities or hidden assets. The Ryders, in their innocence, had walked into a trap set long before their arrival. Their tragic fate might have been the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The revelation shifted the investigation's focus. Avery began to explore connections between Klein, Merrow, and Gate Holdings, and other properties associated with similar incidents. Patterns emerged: properties sold below market value, sudden disappearances of new owners, and a trail of financial irregularities. As Avery pieced together the puzzle, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Ryders' deaths were part of a larger, more complex web of deceit and corruption. The farmhouse was just one node in a network of secrets, and the masked intruders were operatives executing orders from unseen puppet masters. The case had evolved from a family's mysterious disappearance to an exploration of a hidden underworld operating in the shadows of legitimate society. Avery knew that uncovering the truth would require delving into dangerous territory where powerful individuals protected their interests at any cost. The video footage from the barn had reignited public interest, but it also triggered something more valuable: a witness. 3 days after the footage was aired on a local investigative news program, a man walked into the Willow Creek Police Department. His name was Silas Romero, a former independent contractor with no trembling hope, but a deep sense of unease. Nervously clutching a stained baseball cap in his hands, he asked to speak privately with someone in the cold case unit. When brought to Detective Avery Hunt, he sat stiffly and looked her straight in the eye. "I poured that concrete," he said. "The one under the house. I didn't know what it was for." Silas explained that in February 2022, roughly 2 months before the Ryders moved into the farmhouse, he was contacted by an old acquaintance from his days working construction in Albany. The man said there was a cash job, under the table, no names, no paperwork. The task was simple: pour a large slab of concrete in a pre-dug space beneath a farmhouse, late at night, under tight instructions. Silas had done similar jobs before, usually for people avoiding permit issues or landlords cutting corners. But this job was different. The request came with odd stipulations. He had to arrive after 11 p.m., work by generator light only, and leave everything exactly as he found it, including replacing the trap door to the crawl space. It was paid $5,000, 0 cents in cash, stacked in neat bundles, more than double his usual rate. The guy said it was for structural support, Silas told Avery. That they were retrofitting the house to hold heavy equipment. But when I got there, it didn't make sense. The foundation looked fine. They didn't want any photos, no question. Silas admitted that guilt had eaten at him for years, especially after seeing the family's photo in the news. When they vanished, I started thinking, what if I helped bury them? I didn't see any bodies, I swear. The pit was covered with a tarp when I got there. I didn't look under it. I didn't want to. Avery took his statement seriously. She verified Silas's whereabouts through toll records and gas station receipts. His presence in the area during the estimated concrete pour date matched perfectly. The details he recalled, the dimensions of the slab, the type of mix used, the hidden trapdoor, aligned precisely with forensic findings. Silas might not have known the full scope of what he was doing, but he had inadvertently confirmed that the tomb had been prepped long before the Ryders ever arrived. The plan had been in motion well in advance. Simultaneously, forensic accountants, working with Avery, uncovered a financial anomaly in Ethan's history. 3 days before the family vanished, a $25,000 0-cents wire transfer had been deposited into Ethan's personal bank account. The transaction originated from an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, through a blind trust named Greenbridge Holding. The transfer included no memo, no corresponding invoice, and had never been disclosed to Laura or mentioned in any of Ethan's communications. What stunned Avery wasn't just the money, but the timing. The deposit was made 72 hours before the final text Ethan sent Melanie. "We're here." Looks quiet, a little weird, but fine. The funds were withdrawn in full 2 days later, just 1 day before the disappearances. Security footage from the bank branch showed Ethan entering alone, wearing a ball cap and sunglasses, collecting a manila envelope, and leaving within 5 minutes. He didn't appear distressed. If anything, he looked resolved. This transaction changed everything. Ethan hadn't just been running back into it. Greenbridge Holdings had no public record. The name had been used before in various shell entities tied to collapsed investment schemes and laundering operations. One particular link stood out. In 2019, a company called Apex Regional Logistics, a known alias for Solera Apex, had funneled investor money through a Greenbridge account before defaulting. The same web of false front companies, backdoor accounts, and anonymized transfers was back. And now, Ethan's name was on it. Avery speculated that someone had offered Ethan a deal: money, leverage, maybe even protection, in exchange for cooperation or silence. Perhaps he had been coerced into relocating to the farmhouse, thinking it would end his troubles. Perhaps the $25,000 was a down payment. Or a warning. Digging further, the investigative team found a trail of encrypted messages linked to Ethan's deleted email account. They had been sent via a secure platform used in private equity circles, typically for communications involving non-disclosure arrangements. The message headers were coded, but one line stood out, repeated across multiple entries. Asset confirmed, re-entry approved, oversigned. What asset? What re-entry? The phrasing sounded clinical, military, corporate, or both. Avery suspected it referenced either the farmhouse itself or a data cache Ethan had returned from his time with Solera. If he had withheld something incriminating, records, access codes, passwords, someone would have wanted it returned. The first note found under the floor, "What you took, you must return," echoed with new meaning. Maybe Ethan had planned to use the data as leverage. Maybe he never got the chance. What remained most disturbing was how seamlessly the trap had closed. Ethan moved his family, believing it was a fresh start. He accepted money he probably convinced himself was harmless. He thought wife and kids to a place that was safe. And someone used that trust to orchestrate not just his death, but a message. Avery sat in her office, staring at the corkboard plastered with maps, receipts, and photographs. Silas's confession, the offshore wire, the encrypted emails, and now the implication that Harold Klein hadn't just built the tomb, but had done so on behalf of people powerful enough to wait years to finalize their punishment. She ran a fingertip across a highlighted phrase on Ethan's final note. "Don't stop. There's more." She believed him. The threads had finally begun to tie together, no longer frayed but leading to a singular origin point: Martin Lee. His name hadn't surfaced in years, not in official records, not in media reports, but those familiar with the inner workings of Solera Apex remembered him well. He had been the charismatic founder, the public face, the orchestrator of countless private equity deals that promised high yield and low risk. To investors like Ethan Ryder, Martin had seemed like the kind of man you could trust with everything. And Ethan had. Until he realized the empire was built on lies and, worse, on laundering operations disguised as international logistics contracts. Avery had never lost sight of the offshore wire trail. The $25,000 0 cents that hit Ethan's account 3 days before his disappearance was just the beginning. So following Greenbridge Holdings led the team through a maze of digital proxies and shell companies, but one piece finally cracked the illusion. A land deed filed in Nevada for a company called Leland Trust. A signature at the bottom read, Michael Lanny, but the handwriting analyst noted it bore uncanny similarity to Martin Lee's known handwriting, slanted left with a specific loop in the lowercase. A deeper dive into IP logs associated with the deed submission traced the digital origin to a satellite internet provider located in British Columbia. Investigators pulled residency records, flight data, and immigration files. And there he was, Martin Lee, living under the alias Gregory Shaw, managing a boutique vineyard just outside Kelowna, Canada. The Canadian authorities, briefed and cooperative, granted access to search the property. What they found wasn't just a man hiding, it was a man maintaining an entire network. Hidden in the basement of his estate was a secured server, encrypted but not impenetrable. Once accessed, it revealed ledgers, contract scans, and a disturbing document titled Mitigation Protocols, detailing how to manage whistleblowers and internal threats within the investment network. Page 3 contained a direct reference to Ryder Asset Compromise, HC, to resolve discreetly. That was it. The smoking gun. Harold Klein. Resolve discreetly, a euphemism chilling in its casual cruelty. Martin was arrested without incident. During questioning, he initially denied everything, invoking false identity protections. But as the digital evidence mounted, his silence broke. In a taped confession, Martin admitted to authorizing a containment action against Ethan Ryder after learning Ethan had compiled incriminating documents about Solara Apex's offshore accounts and was planning to leak them to federal regulators. He was a friend, Martin said coldly. But he got scared. Fear makes people sloppy. He claimed he never intended for the family to die, only for Ethan to be scared into compliance, but his words were hollow. The operation he greenlit ended in the slow, suffocating death of 2 children and the helpless murder of their parents. With the arrest, Avery's team reassembled the entire timeline with clinical precision. Ethan, approached again by Martin's associates under a false promise of financial recovery, had accepted the $25,000 0 cents, likely hoping to use it to expose them. Instead, he walked his family into a trap. The farmhouse, prepped in advance with a hidden death chamber. The intruders caught on the barn camera, scouting and retrieving whatever evidence might remain. The concrete pour, handled by an unwitting laborer. The return of the bodies, part message, part insurance in case the site was ever rediscovered. All orchestrated by a man who once raised champagne glasses beside Ethan at corporate retreat. News of the arrest brought a wave of closure to Willow Creek and especially to Melanie Hargrove, who had spent 7 years haunted by silence. The state fast-tracked the release of the Ryder remains, and a memorial was held on a cloudy Saturday afternoon in June. Friends, distant relatives, former co-workers, and strangers who had followed the case all came to pay respects. The caskets were light, mostly bone fragments, but the weight in the air was unbearable. Melanie delivered the eulogy. "They trusted the wrong man," she said, voice cracking. "But their love for each other never failed. That's what stays with me. They stayed together. They reached for one another until the very end." As the crowd dispersed, Avery stood alone by the headstone, a simple plaque etched with their names and the words, "Together, always." It was the most peaceful moment in the entire investigation, and in that silence, she finally let herself exhale. Martin Lee was extradited to the U.S., tried on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. He was sentenced to life without parole. Merrow and Gate Holdings was dismantled in a multi-agency raid. Several silent partners were exposed, their assets seized. The house at Willow Creek was demolished and reclassified as a memorial site. Nothing would be built there again. 7 years after a quiet text message and a vanishing family, the case was officially closed. A man had been held accountable. A truth, no matter how horrific, had been uncovered. And the Ryders were no longer lost beneath silence, but remembered for their courage, their bond, and the fight they never got to finish. If this story gave you chills or left you thinking about what really happened behind those closed doors, consider subscribing for more real-life inspired mysteries like this one. We'd love to know, what part of the story shocked you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Your thoughts might lead us to the next mystery.